So I gave a sort of similar talk last week at the Science and Justice Research Center, and I didn't read from a paper, and I totally freestyled it, and it was actually fun, but I'm going to read from a paper today, so maybe it will be less exciting, but hopefully not. So I have it should be about 15 or so minutes, but this is research that I've been working on for a few years now. So I direct a project in San Francisco called the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, and we've been mapping the impact of tech in Silicon Valley on the eviction crisis in both San Francisco and Alameda counties. So I've been studying the impacts and the materializations of Silicon Valley for a while, but I've also been working in Romania, where my mom's family is from, her family's from there, but I've been doing research there since 2009. Looking at evictions, mostly impacting Roma collectives through this sort of post-socialist and also new flows of global capital hybrid. So my research here in the Feminist Studies Department is trying to merge these two projects that I'm working on, and this is a feeble attempt at that. But I am excited for your feedback afterwards. So, okay, so I'm going to begin with a little story. So the medical documents were sorted in stacks, dusty, scattered on the dresser and table in Maria's two-room tiny shack of a home on Cantanole Street. It was August in Patarut, the municipal waste site and pharmaceutical dump of Cluj-Napoca, Romania's Transylvanian capital. In 2010, over 300 Roma, which are Europe's racialized stateless others, had been forcibly relocated to the toxic wasteland space from the city center per an amalgamation of post-socialist reprivatization laws that deny Roma housing due to their failure to own pre-communist property, along with new incursions of transnational industries speculating on post-Cold War economic opportunities. In this case, it was the Finnish IT company Nokia that purchased the rights to what had been Roma housing. Today, there are 4 different Roma collectives mired in Patarut toxicity, beached upon what some people refer to as the Maidan, which is a word that means inhabitable and ungeographic wasteland space, squeezed between the rural and the urban. And the word Maidan actually, interestingly, appears in a lot of countries surrounding Romania and generally has a positive connotation, but in Romania, it has a negative connotation. So stranded in post-socialist space, the revalorization of cityscapes incites dispersals of Romania's most pathologized racial minority into toxic sinkholes. Stranded in post-socialist time, the rhythm of modernity's drumbeat only registers as progress to some. In other words, in the temporality of post-socialism, Roma matters are spatial matters, and borrowing from Catherine McKittrick in forming that sort of statement. Crowded in the shade of her small shack of a home, as mildew saturated the air, Maria was explaining how, during the days of communism, members of her family had factory jobs, but now, after being fired due to racism, her brother and children resort to scavenging juice boxes at the dump. Racialization functions through pathologization, she inferred, noting the documentation of her nephew, Dumitru, and her son, Iulian, as mentally ill, a psychic ascription pinioned upon their racialized bodies, rendering them unhireable. To escape such assignation, others in her community have left Romania in recent years, hopeful of employment in Western spaces such as Northern Ireland, where they are confronted with new and old forms of racism. For instance, in Belfast in 2009, over 100 newly arrived Roma were attacked by loyalist-affiliated neo-Nazis, leading to their repatriation back to the Romanian Maidan. This is their quote-unquote nomadic reality. As Maria poured heaps of medical documents in piles in front of me, each encased in plastic folders, wilted by the years, the dirt, and the heat, Iulian entered a tiny barrack of a home, tall and smiling. He was taking wet clothes out of the house to dry in the sun, he said, shyly. As Maria extricated his medical papers from the pile, waving them excitedly in the air, he just shrugged and later explained that he liked being in the special programs, as it was less likely he would be beaten up by non-Roma. Maria overheard, shook her head quickly, and interjected that this is why she never taught her children Romani, because she feared their discrimination. Iulian nodded and explained that while he could comprehend the traditional language, he could only speak Romanian, and so Romani is not Romanian, even though people think they're the same. Romanian is the national language, and Romani is a traditional language. But Iulian could speak another language too, he quickly evidenced, that of electronics. Most evenings, Iulian scavenges broken devices in the garbage fields, computers, CD players, radios. After fidgeting with some dials on the TV that he had recovered and restored, he exclaimed, "Voila," as a moving character appeared upon the screen, illuminating the dimness of their home with an RBG palette. Maria relaxed back and smiled, proud of his ingenuity. From within the toxins of pharmaceutical waste, detritus, and discard, from upon an intentionally ghettoized landscape increasingly home to those referred to as Romania as unfavored, multiple racial histories seep together and sediment. Their alienation partly shatters, however, as data transmits from a distant satellite tower to Julian's repaired television. Yet ironically, IT, a growing industry emblematic of the cleaner, lighter industry heralded by newfound liberal teleologies, is in part responsible for what people are calling the urban renewal of Cluj, the city heralded as Europe's new Silicon Valley. This article just came out a couple weeks ago. Interestingly, imagos of cleaner and lighter digital futures emerged in Silicon Valley throughout the whole heart of the Cold War, funded by US government to contain communist threat and surpass Soviet science, birthing not only cyborg informatics, but also contexts of gentrification. It was during the Cold War that what had been the orchard capital of the world, fueled by racialized immigrant labor, mutated into a landscape of whitened and putatively post-racial suburban campuses, bolstered by the white flight engendered by white city dwellers fleeing mid-century contexts of Black migration from the South. It was the collapse of the Iron Curtain that Silicon Valley informatics, it was with the collapse of the Iron Curtain that Silicon Valley informatics were able to penetrate not only the space of the former Second World, but that also new technologies of mobility allowed infiltration into Silicon Valley's urban backyard of San Francisco and Oakland. I just saw this on the BART last week, but as you can see, Silicon Valley is trying to find all of the spaces it can in its proximity. But Romania, which now boasts the 5th fastest global internet speeds due to its fiber optic infrastructures, has seen a variety of corporations and transient tech workers anchored to California's Silicon Valley make new discoveries of the region, from Timișoara, which has gone on record for the world's fastest download speed, to Bucharest, the new Eastern European headquarters of Google, which is now partnered with Nokia and working with Uber. So, digital nomads, or sometimes they refer to themselves as digital gypsies, mobile tech workers enabled by liquid capital, have increasingly migrated to Romania, utilizing on-demand apps, allowing them to materialize a supposed techno-utopic immateriality. The tourist industry itself has risen to the occasion, with the Lonely Planet travel guide marking Transylvania the top global region of 2016, a place for tourists to ride Uber Transit and reside in Airbnb housing while enjoying the archaic countryside. And as you can see here, the Lonely Planet is excited for tourists to stay in chic Airbnb housing while riding Uber and marveling at the historic countryside. So ironically, this region has also become the most transnationally exploited in Europe for forest and mineral resources, racially, spatially impacting Roma labor and housing outside of cities too, under the guise of advanced technology. While digital nomads parade around the globe anywhere that Wi-Fi transmits signal, Romania's fiber optics, new light industry, and supposed abundance of highly skilled surplus labor has served as particular impetus. Questions thus arise as to whether or not the digital nomad of post-socialist Romania indexes a new imperium, in this case that of Silicon Valley IT networks, as well as modernity's contradictory desire for pre-modernity. Does it also perhaps indicate a new kind of human taking shape and form upon Romanian landscapes? So this presentation addresses the geopolitical and cultural forms of what I term Silicon Valley imperialism in the context of post-socialism. Analyzing new tech economies as post-socialist, I'm able to trace their racial forms, studying material and chimerical tethering between Silicon Valley and Romania as the time and space of post-socialism becomes global and yet uneven. As such, post-socialist analytics facilitate the mapping of transitions' technologic effects, for which Roma include racialized Maidan conscription upon the unreliable cartography of discard and waste. To escape toxic futures, transition also propels Roma to migrate to Western European spaces, from Northern Ireland to Italy to France, where older racist forms morph with their arrival, inciting repatriation back to the Romanian Maidan. So as such, my project is multi-sided, and that's why I'm looking at Silicon Valley, Romania, and also Europe as a whole. But my project is also genealogical, constitutive of two racial forms that amalgamate, yet that are held in tension in the historical present, that of dysgenics, presaged by eugenic racial science, and that of digital nomadism, invocative of romantic Orientalist fantasies of the free and wandering gypsy. This historical approach enables an argument that on one hand, Maidan conscription is only made possible today through the invocation of older pre-communist racial forms that denied Roma property ownership. Roma matters are spatial matters today precisely because they were prior to communism. After all, antecedent to communism was the Holocaust, in which Roma were targeted for elimination, and whereby nomadism was used as a racial signifier. And before that, histories of slavery and failed reparations prevented land ownership. On the other hand, a historical approach allows an argument that global capital, transiting technological networks, embodied by digital nomadism and emboldened through post-humanist ontologies, is haunted by a different racial form, that of romantic Orientalism. It was during the height of the 19th century that European fantasies of the free and wandering gypsy first emerged in novella form, allegorizing settler nostalgic desire of spatial and temporal border crossing. These narratives reiterated plots in which Western European men discovered and hypersexualized Romani women, fell in love with them, attempted to become gypsy, and then ultimately killed the object of their desire, indexing the materialization of colonial land space subsumption and the immaterialization of retrograde time travel into a pre-industrial past. In studying contemporary racial forms as they conjure those of history, my project argues that modalities of Roma pathologization and romanticization index the fears, dreams, and ambivalences of national and imperial formations in supplementary ways compared to that of other racialized subject formations. As tales of gypsy freedom proliferated from the hearts of imperial formations at their 19th century zeniths, and as they are re-inhabited today through the digital nomad and IT networks centralized in Silicon Valley, especially prolific within unicorn startups, I suggest that Silicon Valley's imperium is both enabled and allegorized by the wanderings of its nomadic avatar. And the startups are basically called unicorns if they achieve a net worth of $1 billion, which is a mythical net worth, but it's another sort of avatar of global capital and liquid mobility. Upon Romanian space, the digital nomad not only displaces Roma life worlds through appropriative techniques, but its own materialization incites the urban renewal and the racialization and revalorization of space. As such, Roma are inscribed as nomadic or homeless on the basis that they were not pre-communist property owners, which was made impossible through national racial histories. Otherwise, they are conscripted to the toxic space of the Maidan or propelled into Western European spaces festering with racial hostility. As the digital nomadic form coalesces in Romania, this project asks, what are the racial spatial borders and histories that precondition its own possibility? While race has long been a technology of both placement and displacement, I question how racialized constructs of mobility and eugenics/dysgenics are renegotiated as novel technologies come to fruition upon the post-socialist landscape. To theorize this new post-socialist man and its racial spatial conjunctures, I draw upon Sylvia Wynter's conception of Homo economicus, the Western bourgeois liberal monohumanist man, a figure that allegorizes the transmission of free market capitalism into a new genre of humanity. This new genre is characterized by a relentless proliferation of techno-industrial, techno-automated profiteering. As a model, its viability requires the repression of all others, a subsumption only made possible with the collapse of the Cold War and global capital's newfound ability to penetrate not only the former Second World, but also the quote-unquote third. During this era, Wynter maps outlying models of humans that endure in collectives of extant nomadic or sedentary indigenous, traditionally stateless societies, now being pushed out of their ostensibly underdeveloped places totally. That's her quote. Not only are these racialized stateless outliers asymmetrically dispossessed of home in unprecedented rates as Homo economicus imposes new spatial value, but they are also biocentrically being forced into a singular, homogeneous descriptive statement anchored to monohumanist man. This singularity, Wynter argues, exists not only in the realm of bios, but also in that of mythos, as history itself is narrated by Homo economicus, normalizing the logics of free trade and liberal democracy. So while we can observe the transition from communism to free market capitalism in Romania as a movement that, welcoming the bios mythos of Homo economicus, my project calls for an interpolation of the archetypal man that preceded and follows this conjuncture. So who the ideal quote-unquote man was before and after this figure. As such, I introduce a new mythos of characters to genealogize the historical present. I begin with a figure that I nominate Homo Biopolitica, based on the 1926 manifesto Biopolitica, written by the social hygienicist, eugenicist, Iulian Moldovan in Romania, who called for a wiping away of all Roma from the national biology. It was during this interwar era that the eugenicist policy flourished, eventually culminating in the Holocaust, when both Roma and Jews were transported to Transnistrian death camps, which not many people know about, when they centralized the Holocaust as the kind of biopolitical event. Often Roma are wiped away from the picture, as is the space of Transnistria, which today sits between Moldova and the Ukraine. During this time, nomadism itself was used as a racial signifier to pathologize mobility, pinioning a bios mythos upon Romani corporalities to justify their cleansing from the social body. So along with Homo Biopolitica, I introduce the figure of what I call Homo Communist. To do so, I draw on the figure of Homo Sovieticus, who the Russian writer Alexander Zinoviev popularized in 1986 to describe the ideal form of the heroic Soviet worker in the USSR and the satellite states. This worker absorbed and was absorbed by party lines, accepting structures of rule, indifferent to private property and profit. So here I rename this figure Homo Communist to mark the Romanian Communist Party the party's own desires to free the nation from Soviet control. So basically, we have this Homo Biopolitica figure, and then this Homo Communist figure, and then with post-socialist transition, we could say that there emerges Homo economicus. So upon the dysgenic racialized wastelands of Romania, we're seeing that in post-socialist times, Roma become nostalgic for communist history because even though communist policy tried to assimilate Roma difference and absorb them into the national worker, for the first time in national history, they were provided with housing and employment and education. So a lot of people after 1989 in Romania who were not Roma looked back on communism as this awful time of dictatorship and repression and social control. A lot of Roma actually look back on it as the only time in history when they were provided with social amenities. And then they become pathologized for having this sort of post-socialist nostalgia, which a lot of promulgators of the free market think is immature. So upon this dysgenic racialized wasteland of Romania, such nostalgia muddies the temporality of modernity's progress. Frequently, Roma invoke desire for the times of communism against the grain of liberal democratic logics. As an elderly Roma woman decried to me of her future, or lack thereof, in Patarut, she did not want to die only to be buried in the garbage, as there was nowhere else to go. "Who will bury me elsewhere?" she shouted, while sitting upon sacks of rotting corn husks next to 4 flea-ridden kittens cramped into the humidity of a windowless shed. Or as a friend of mine, Marian, explained in Bucharest after being forcibly repatriated from the West back to Romania, "I can't work, never, because I am gypsy," he said. "They tell me there are no more jobs. My other friends who are gypsy fare the same situation. Nobody gives them a job because they are gypsies. Even if you are a white gypsy, if the boss finds out, you are fired." Marian is fluent in 14 languages, self-taught like Julian is with his electronics, but unemployed and in mourning, longing for the days of communism when, despite policies to repress Romani difference, housing, medical care, and employment existed for Roma. While many Roma do invoke forms of communist nostalgia, others decry that they were forcibly sedentarized and that authorities often confiscated their gold, often their entire family savings. Nevertheless, while numerous scholars have categorized communist nostalgia as pathological, because socialism offered Roma opportunities of living that they had otherwise been denied throughout national history, it becomes clear that the temporality of post-socialist nostalgia, if we are to call it that, is racialized. As Anita Starosta argues, there is no common time of post-socialism. So while many Roma long for pre-socialist times, or socialist times, sorry, others simply articulate their current struggles as a desire for something yet to come. At the same time, others complicate the racial spatial technologies of dysgenic futurity with acts sometimes as simple, yet nevertheless as complex, as repairing a broken TV. Not only do these articulations throw into question grammars of modernity, but they also remind us that just as post-socialism is far from temporally homogeneous, neither were prior errors. Yet Cold War logics frequently collapse pre-communist fascism with Ceausescu's repressive regime, obviating distinct differences between the two eras, including those of race. While archival work on the Transnistrian genocide was made nearly impossible during the bulk of the communist regime, after 1989 when the National Archives were opened up, archival work has gravitated towards tracing communist repression over the racialized violence that preceded it, now also available. So with the collapse of the Cold War, it appears that Winter's Homo economicus has abdicated Homo communis's throne, and in doing so has rewritten the racial spatial configurations of Homo biopolitica, but through new means: property restitution and economic privatization, which when combined, pathologize and conscript Roma upon the Maidan wasteland, essentially punishing them for not having been pre-1946 property owners. And as this transpires, a new human emerges upon the post-socialist landscape, one that, unlike Homo economicus, who venerates Lockean ontologies of freedom to privatize, also worships a different kind of freedom. This new human, whether we call it the digital nomad, the post-human, or as I venture, even Homo technologicus, romanticizes the freedom of immateriality, transience, and real time. While it is ascribed to post-racial configurations, it is nevertheless enabled by a racial anchor, that of the free and wandering gypsy of romantic Orientalism. So, yeah. Unlike the racial form of modern-day dysgenics, eugenics, global capital transiting technological networks, embodied by digital nomadism, free trade, and even at times post-humanist discourse, enacts a different racial form and invokes a different type of nostalgia. This nostalgia invokes that first articulated in Romantic Orientalist literature. Like in days of old, it disappears Roma bodies in its racial appropriation. For instance, this man, his name is James Taylor, but he's not the musician, that he identifies as an award-winning entrepreneur, a white middle-class professional living in a first world country. And he wrote this article in 2011 describing the rise of his new lifestyle, that of the digital gypsy, in which he and his wife transit between Europe and the US, running a number of app-enabled autopilot businesses. In his words, being a digital gypsy is more of a frame of mind than a genealogy. So we've got that. As his testimony evidences, the gypsy nomad has endured as a transnational racial fantasy from the 19th century. Yet the fantasy has become abstracted through its spatial and temporal travel, an abstraction that in transiting through contemporary liberalism now expresses three desires: individual fantasy of spatial and temporal transgression, corporate strategy of surplus accumulation, and not least of all, epistemic post-humanist modernity. After all, discourses of nomadism saturate social theory today and philosophy, in which we are taught that the sedentarism venerated in earlier imperial and liberal formations is outmoded, and in which we are instructed to think of culture as hybrid and rhizomatic, enabling roots with a U more than roots with two O's. In this way, we can observe the racial fantasy of the nomadic. We can observe that the fantasy has mutated and transited from one constellation of imperial formation to another, ontologically and epistemologically. But Taylor is far from alone in collapsing privileged meanderings with this disfigured imaginary of the liberated gypsy nomad, as can be observed in both techno-utopian sharing economies and emergent Deleuzian strains of post-humanist nomadology. While the sharing economy utilizes the privileged transience of its users, such as Taylor, to both settle space and accumulate capital, the post-human has been theorized as post-racial, a human hybrid unhinged from the borders between the digital, the material, transiting through virtual lines of flight. While my aim is not to conflate capital logics of the sharing economy with the ontologies of the post-human directly, I do think that fantasies of freedom articulated in both are appropriated by the gypsy, and I think that says a lot about different forms of privilege and racial fantasy. And as Toby Sonneman rhetorically questions, how would we be able to conceive of freedom without the gypsies? But it's only in post-socialist times that I argue that this figure can find expression. This figure, a product of what I assert as Silicon Valley IT imperialism, by which I mean the global domination of Silicon Valley-based infrastructures, corporations, and sociality, relies upon techno-utopic liberalism, imagining that new technologies will remedy the world's maladies by providing real-time global connectivity. As an imperial formation, Silicon Valley remains anchored to the temporal and spatial centrality of its California home, and yet, like with any imperial form, it expands nodes and edges, establishing outposts in Romanian spaces, such as Cluj. And I think I'm going to, just walk you through the rest of this. So I've been studying the impact of Silicon Valley and Airbnb in the Bay Area, which I think is sort of this testing ground for the different technologies that what I'm calling this new imperialism creates. You can see here, these are all of the what are considered Google bus stops or tech bus stops in the Bay Area that enable basically people to work in Silicon Valley yet live in San Francisco. They go as far south as Santa Cruz. We've actually found that 69% of evictions in the Bay region transpire within 4 blocks of these tech bus stops because they compel property value to rise. But they enable this sort of mobility where you can work in this like white suburban-esque campus that has its own history, but then live in these cool, hip urban centers and appropriate local cultures, but also disappear them as evictions and property rates correspond to them. But I think that's one kind of sort of ontological form that's generated here and enabled here. Then we've got, of course, Airbnb units. This map down here, you can see actually, but the average Airbnb unit in San Francisco costs at least $200 a month. In Oakland, it's in the mid, like 150, 160 range. But Airbnb exists in over 190 countries, and anytime a guest or host uses the service, they actually pay the corporation, which is based in San Francisco, a percentage, normally about 10%. So anytime anybody's using it in, whether it's Romania or somewhere else, this corporation's getting money. But it does enable this new form of mobility, and people such as digital nomads find it to really enable their lifestyle. This map here on the left is basically all the digerati dorms that I could research, but these are tech dorms that generally cost they could cost as much as $1,000 a week, and again, they're these sort of transient housing spots for people to work as they try to get jobs in Silicon Valley, and often they're guarded by people who actually don't let you rent basically a bed in a dorm unless you are part of that culture, which is 60% white, 70% male, 90-something% under the age of 40. So that's the demographic, which is not the demographic of what these spaces are that these digerati dorms exist in. And again, you can see these are just the evictions surrounding the Google bus and Apple bus stops in San Francisco. So I go on and on about the work we're doing in the mapping project and how I'm using that to sort of theorize what I'm seeing as this global phenomenon. But we can talk about that, and I don't need to read about it. So that's my presentation.
Thanks.
Yeah.